Welcome back to another episode of Learning Vue.js the hard way. And what I mean with the hard way is that we are learning Vue.js by reading the documentation. We're reading through the official guide to Vue.js on Vue.js.org. And in the last video, let me say this, we're in the section on the template syntax. So we're in the section, like the big section on the template language used in Vue.js. And in the last video, we dove into the interpolation section, and we talked about interpolation, or interpolating with text, and we talked about interpolating with raw HTML. But then we talked about a bunch of other stuff as well. But what we are going to talk about now is interpolation in attributes, and then followed by using JavaScript expressions. But then probably we'll get to a bit more stuff as well. And also, I'm realizing now, in the last video, I then said something along the lines of that interpolations interpolate mixed content, whereas directives interpolate or bind attributes. But of course, they've put the attribute section here in interpolations rather than in directives. But it's kind of my understanding that most attributes are directives, or the way you bind attributes is by using the vbind directive. So yeah, maybe that's it. I think that's just an organization question. But then maybe the thing I said about interpolations interpolating mixed content, that's probably not entirely accurate, since they also put this attributes section in the interpolation section. So probably they're just thinking about this as in that you can interpolate your HTML. You can sort of mix bound data with just static HTML, like your regular HTML, and then you can mix in sort of the stuff that's bound to your data model. But anyways, these are just some minor points. Either way, that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me also just mention, if you haven't watched the other videos in this series, we're sort of building on top of the stuff that we've learned before. So if you haven't watched the previous episodes, I would highly recommend that you watch the previous episodes. And let me take this chance to also say, maybe subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss the upcoming videos. What I'm trying to do in this series is that I'm trying to explain as much as possible so that you don't have to keep your eyes glued to the screen while watching these series, and maybe you can multitask and do the dishes or whatever floats your boat, right? Anyways, let's now dive into the section. We're going to talk about attributes. So remember, we're talking about the templating language of Vue.js. So mustaches, as we talked about in the last video, right? Like the mustaches that you use to denote that in this particular place I want to interpolate in the value, I want to bind to a value from my data model. And then to do that, we use mustaches. Let me just scroll up here, to show that we use this kind of stuff, where you say opening mustache, some variable name, and then closing mustache. And then you're interpolating in that the value that's in your data model, and you're binding to whatever changes. You're observing any changes that happens in the data model, so that if the data model changes, then the HTML will be updated. Anyways, So what they're saying is that for attributes, you can't use this mustache syntax. Instead, you have to use the vbind directive. Let's just check where this link goes as well. It's probably taking us to the, what is it called, API reference, right? Yeah, that's what they're doing. And remember, in the previous video, we talked about how it's very, very useful to sort of go back and refer to this API reference, or use this API reference document when you need to figure out the details of some particular thing, or want to know more about the particular thing. And let me also just mention that I think it's very important to view the video series that I'm doing right now as complementary to the documentation. I'm in no way trying to replace the documentation, right? If you've, I'm super glad if you follow along on this whole video series. I'm sure both of us will learn tons from that. But it's then very important that you don't necessarily just go back into this video series when you're looking for something. Try to use the guide and the API reference to dive back in to figure out some detail, right? It's not, unless of course you're looking for some specific representation or metaphor that I used to make it easier to understand a particular thing, then of course, or like one of the bazillion details that I throw in that are tangentially related but hopefully relevant. If you're looking for that, then for sure go back into these videos, right? But otherwise, clearly the guide here and the API reference the official Vue documentation is the official documentation. So whenever you're wondering, whenever you're wondering something, you should prefer to just find it there first, because that's probably just faster. But anyways, if you're looking for something that's specific in my videos, of course jump back to my videos. Okay, that's just a parenthesis. I'm trying to complement their documentation. Okay, now mustaches cannot be used inside HTML attributes, right? So if you let's look at an example, right? We have this folder that we've been working with all the time. We have the index.html file and we have the main.js file. So if I just jump into Vim, let's open up the HTML file, for example, right? So we don't have anything that's bound here with the mustache syntax. Let me just check if we have any sort of variables left in the main.js file. Let me turn off wrapping. Nope, set, what is that, unwrap? No, sorry, no wrap. Sorry, just Vim. Okay. So yeah, so we have this message here. Okay. So this is a leftover from the last episode where we were messing around with rendering HTML dynamically, right? Like rendering HTML based on whatever is in the data model. So let's just say hello world here instead in the message variable. And let's go back to the, let me just scroll through here to see if we haven't left anything sort of strange. Yep. Maybe actually let me just remove these hooks also, right? Before update and update. That's stuff we talked about in a previous video, just to sort of clean this up a bit, right? Actually, we don't need this cart item component anymore, do we? I mean, okay, if I save this file, let's go back to index.html. No, okay, so we're using cart item here, so we do need that. Okay. So we have this one component. So let me open up our index.html file to see sort of where we are at and what's the current status is. Okay, so that's the stuff that we have now. You can see we have this this input, this fruit input field in the top. And then we have this extra input field that we were messing around with last time. So let's remove that so we have less stuff, right? If I just remove those two lines. And then maybe remove this message as well, right? Let's just say maybe P, or let's put an H1 in the top, right? And then just render the message using the mustache syntax on the top of the page inside an H1. So let's refresh this, right? So then you can see, okay, we have hello world here. Actually, let me, instead of a H1, let's make this a P tag, because otherwise it's just so big. Okay, so we have the message here. And then we have this this input field and a button that we've had all the time. And if you click add, you add stuff to this list, right? Super fine. We call these things cart items, and we're adding a single fruit, which, yeah, all of this stuff makes no sense, but like semantically. But at some point, we'll probably start to sort of clean this up and turn this into a to-do list or whatever. But now we're just messing around, right? So we have this. So let's assume then that we have this message variable. What was my point? Where was I going? So I was going to say mustaches cannot be used. Right. This is what we were looking at. Mustaches cannot be used inside HTML attributes. So what we want to do is, let's say I'm trying to figure out a scenario. Like, let's say you wanna, I mean, let's not do an image, let's not do a link. I'm thinking whether we should do a color, but that's silly because you should put that in CSS. Should we do, yeah, no, okay, so maybe we should do a picture, right? Or a link, right? Let's do something silly. So let's say instead of the message, let's go back to main.js. Let's eliminate the message variable in the data model, and let's say that we have a let's say URL. I'm gonna call, or let's call it link, right? Just so we have a simple name for it. And let me just link that to https ://example.com. Okay, so. Or actually, yeah, okay, but it doesn't matter what link I choose. Okay, so in our data model we now have a link. If I of course if I refresh the page, we don't have that because our index template is rendering the message rather than the URL. And of course, if the message variable is null or undefined, then we will get simply just an empty string. But if I now change this for link, so I'm sort of using mustache syntax to print that link, then we get this, right? But what if we actually want to make that a link, right? Notice now it's just text, right? So if I say ahref, and then we need to put some link here, but let's do that in a moment. And then let's still use mustache syntax to sort of render out the link, like just render it out as text. Oh, sorry, now I closed the P tag, but I meant to close the A tag. Okay, let's actually maybe let's put that in a paragraph as well. Okay, so let's save that and let's refresh. Okay, so now you have a link, right? But of course, this just links to an anchor, right? There's nothing. We're not actually linking this anywhere. Let me see if I can show this in the inspector without actually opening it. Yeah. So here we can show the HTML, right? So maybe I make this a bit bigger, make this a bit bigger. Sorry, maybe just have a look at this and see if you can find the href or the link in the code to the right, and I'll just let the cat in. Okay, sorry. So clearly you could probably see that we have the link here, of course, and then the rendered href attribute, or the value for the value that the attribute href is pointing to, or that the key href in this a tag is pointing to, is this hashtag, right? Because that's what we put here. But what we want to do is we want to render the link, and so spontaneously you might think that you could do this, right? And then you could use the mustache tag inside the value here of the href attribute. And I think even I made this mistake previously in the series, just sort of spontaneously, even though I knew that you can't do that. But let's just refresh and see what we get, right? And notice here now that, I mean, it's still a link because we're linking somewhere, but you can see here in the HTML that it's not actually fetching the data from our data model. It's just rendering like explicitly exactly what we said, which is sort of this mustache link. So if I click this, of course, it's not going to work because, I mean, that's not a link, right? Let me, yeah, okay. So I think example.com is an example domain, right? I hope it's not spam. I think that's like a reserved, yeah, example domain. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I thought this was like a sort of official example domain. Anyways, okay. So how do we make that happen then? Well, what we do is we have to use this directive vbind, which we've talked about before, right? So I mean, I'm not going to dive into it deeply, but we have to say v-bind, v-bind, colon, and then the attribute that we want to bind, which is href. And then we don't specify this mustache because since we're using bind, it's explicit that what we are doing is that we are binding this attribute href to whatever variable that we put here, which is whatever variable we have in our data model, or some variable in our data model. So here I need to put, oops, wrong buttons. Sorry, so in this parenthesis, we change that for a link, essentially. So I'm essentially just removing the mustaches. And if we refresh this, you should see that it works, right? Because now we're actually rendering example.com. And of course, if I would, now this is a pretty stupid example, but instead of, no, actually, let's do this. Let's say so now our input field is binding to fruit, but if we change the v model of that, so we're binding our input field to link, then notice, then here this starts out as example.com, right? And if I change, and you can see here in the HTML that we have example.com for that link. And if I now rewrite the stuff that we have in this input field to, let's say, youtube.com, then you can see that the href changes to youtube.com here, even in like both in the attribute of the link and also in the text of the link. And the attribute is because of this vbind, and the text is because of this mustache syntax. So I would guess that when you use vbind, notice that we have this syntax, right, where it's like vbind colon some key, right, which in our case was href, but presumably it can be any attribute, and then equals, and then we put whatever whatever value that we, or whatever variable that we want to bind to, whatever variable in our data model that we want to bind to. And as we've shown before, now we don't have that, right? But you might have, like, if you have a nested object, or if you have a deep object as your data model, where you have like maybe like person with name dot and then first, for example. So it's like you have a person object that has a name key, and then that name key, or that name key is pointing to an object which has the key first and the key last, for example. Then you can link this, or you can dive downwards and you can bind to person dot name dot first, for example, right? So you can you can sort of traverse downwards, or look up things deeper inside an object. So that's totally possible. This we've tried out before as well. But one thing that I'm a bit interested in and just want to find out is, I'm wondering if there are sort of a whitelisted set of attributes that we can bind to, or whether it is so that you can actually bind to any attribute. Like what I mean is, like, if we said vbind, and then let's say we want to bind the, oh sorry, the wrong syntax, v dash bind colon, let's say we want to bind the attribute foo, which is clearly not an HTML attribute, right? Let's say we bind that to link as well. Does that work or not, right? Let's refresh this and see if that works. Yeah, so that actually works. You can see. So we get here in the HTML, we have foo equals http :/example.com. Let me just make sure that, I mean, it's unlikely, but what if foo is actually an attribute of HTML? Yeah, no, I mean, now I just made up this arbitrary attribute of a bunch of letters, and that works as well. So that's pretty cool, right? So vbind is designed such that they don't have to update the source code of Vue whenever the HTML spec changes, such that they are introducing new attributes, or if you are using some other library that expects you to use some like made up attribute on an element that isn't HTML specific, but that is maybe specific to that library. So then you can actually still bind to such attributes, because you can say v-bind colon whatever attribute you want, whatever attribute you've made up, such as foo, and then you can point that to a variable that you have. Okay, super cool. I'm guessing that makes sense, right? Because also we've looked a bit at it before, so we're just going to move on. But then there's this portion here, right, which is pretty interesting, and that is that for some attributes in HTML, such as, for example, the disabled attribute. Let's just see. Let me try to find. Yeah, here, Mozilla. So let's just read on this, right? The disabled attributes indicates whether the element is disabled or not. Well, I mean, unsurprisingly, if this attribute is set, so I'm reading, right, from the Mozilla docs. If this attribute is set, the element is disabled. Disabled elements are usually drawn with grayed out text, right? So it's like telling the browser to render this particular element in a specific manner that it may know how to do or not. Like, consider this picture that they have here, where they have a button called remove all that is sort of grayed out because it is disabled. It does not respond to user actions. It can't be focused. Blah 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 blah. Forms will not be submitted. And then here's the important part, right? Do not set the attribute to true, as this will suggest you can set it to false to enable the element again, which is not the case, right? So what they mean, I was hoping that we would have an HTML example, but you can see here that to disable an element, if you're using JavaScript to interact with a DOM, you need to set the attribute disabled. And then, yeah, they're setting the attribute disabled to the value disabled. And then to enable it, they are simply removing that attribute. So, sorry, cats again. Okay, so what this means to us as Vue developers is, I mean, in some sense, it doesn't really matter too much. The point is just that, let's just look at an example. So in our HTML, let's just add this button. It's like, well, clickable. Let's just write clickable. I mean, it doesn't matter. We have this button, right? And then let's go to our page and let's look at that. So now we have this clickable button, which is now, you can see, clickable. I can actually click it. Let me make this a bit bigger. It's clickable. But if I put the disabled attribute, disabled, like that, and then refresh, you can see, okay, so hopefully you can see, it's visually it wasn't too different, but it's now actually not clickable. Let's add 2 of these, and let's make one disabled and the other, whoops, and the other not disabled. Yeah, okay, they're not actually different, but hopefully you can see that I can focus and I can click one of them, but I can't click nor focus the other one. Now, the issue is that if you say disabled true, I guess that would have exactly the same effect. Whoops, true, like that. Refresh, yeah, then I can't click it. But if I would say disabled false, let's save and refresh, it's still actually disabled, right? So this has nothing to do with Vue. I guess it also sort of has nothing to do with JavaScript, but it has to do with the HTML specification. So in HTML, the specification says that if you want to disable something, then you should simply just say, just add the attribute disabled. So disabled is not really a key value pair. It's more like you're just so the mere existence of the attribute disabled specifies that the element is disabled. So I would think that, this is valid. My understanding is that this is valid HTML, right? That you only need to specify the attribute disabled. You shouldn't say disabled equals something. And so what does that mean, right? But that means that there are some special cases to vbind. So when we say v-bind href equals link, for example, then we say that the href element, like on the element there needs on the element that's being rendered, there needs to be an attribute that needs to be called href, because that's what I wrote here, href. So it needs to be called href. But then it should be equal to, so what it should render is that it should render href equals quotation marks, and then whatever the value is inside the variable that I've specified, which in this case happens to be link. But if I do that for disabled, right, let's think about that. If I say vbind disabled equals, and then my variable is maybe, let's say is disabled, and then let's go to our main.js file and add an is disabled property to our data model, and let's just say true for that, right? What should it render, right? Presumably it should render disabled equals true. So let's look at that, right? If we okay, now I can't actually right click exactly that element because it's disabled, so clearly it's disabled. But let me just open up the inspector here and let's manually find that element. So here you can see, right, what it renders is actually disabled equals disabled, right? So either this is a special case on the basis of the fact that we are interacting with the attribute disabled, or it's a special case in the fact that we are sending a boolean as a value, or that we are binding to a boolean property of the data model. So let's try that out. If we would vbind to foo instead, right, and let's just look at what happens then. Then they actually, right, they explicitly render foo equals true. So Vue have specified, or the creators of Vue, in the Vue source code, there are some special cases, such as, for example, the attribute disabled. So if you pass true, actually, instead of specifying the model thing here, I could probably just specify true, right? Because we can specify exceptions. Yeah, so I can specify true here directly, and then we get disabled. Like we get the presence of the attribute disabled. But what if I would say false here, right? What if I don't want to disable? What if my data model says that this thing should not be disabled? Then it's not rendered, right? Notice how we are not rendering the attribute disabled, which means the lack of existence of the, or the missing presence of the attribute disabled means that the element is not disabled, and now this thing is clickable again. So that's, I guess that's what they're saying here, right? So yeah, if if the thing, but here they're actually saying that other thing, right? If the value is null, undefined, or false, the disabled attribute, this disabled attribute will not even be included in the rendered button element, right? So they also use the button in their example, and they're looking at sort of essentially the same example as we were doing. Yeah, but so sorry, I read this sentence now as that maybe this would mean, because I was posing sort of two hypotheticals. I was saying that maybe it's that there are some special cases around what attributes are sort of act in a different way, as in like when they're false, when the value is false, they're not even rendered. Either it's that, like that's the special case rule, or the special case rule is something along the lines of that whenever the value is falsy, like null or undefined or false, then it's simply rendered differently. But it seems that that's not what they mean. I mean, this is a very specific statement because this is in regards to the disabled attribute, right? So it's a statement specifically about the disabled attribute. So I would assume that they have a bunch of special cases for the attributes that in the HTML spec is sort of said to that like either you have this attribute or you don't have this attribute. And when you have this attribute, like that implies that that attribute is true, and if you don't have that attribute, that implies that that property is false. So yeah, let me do unwrap. Oh, sorry, set no wrap. Sorry, I need to put that in my vimrc. Okay, so yeah, hopefully that makes sense, right? It's like there are some special cases such as disabled. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't actually know what the other attributes of the HTML spec is that are like this attribute. Please do shoot something in the comments if you happen to know that spontaneously. But yeah, so that's a sort of special case, which again, like to us as Vue developers, if you never thought about this, you would probably be fine anyway, right? Because it's kind of like Vue handles it the correct way. Let's think about it that way. But I guess don't be surprised if you see that your HTML lacks the existence of some attribute that you were expecting to be there. Maybe then it's simply that attribute is a sort of truthy or true-false attribute or a Boolean attribute, where maybe the value that you are passing to that attribute is false, and hence Vue is not even rendering that element, which is a correct, or is not even rendering that attribute, which is then the correct thing to do, right? And of course, I mean, I guess we can, yeah, I'm just thinking like it's, yeah, okay, I mean, you can probably see this. I was thinking maybe we should exemplify by having a button and then we bind to the click event, and when you click it, you sort of switch back and forth between disabled and not. Yeah, I think that might actually be a good thing to do. We could do that in the next section probably, but let's just think about it this way. Maybe I guess another attribute would be visible or something like that. Visibility. Don't we have an attribute like that in JavaScript? No, the button is visible. Let me just visibility HTML attribute. Isn't there? I'm pretty sure, or maybe that's just like a maybe that's in hidden. Okay, sorry. Maybe that visibility is probably in CSS. Let's just see how that what happens with that. No. Oh, sorry. Okay, but we have hidden false. My bad. Hidden, silly me. Okay, hidden true. Refresh. Yeah, then the button disappeared, and you can see we have hidden. But if we say false, if hidden is false, then we're simply not rendering the hidden attribute, right? So hidden behaves in the same way as disabled, and that's more obvious, right? So then maybe let's add a p tag here and say something like secret text. That's the contents of this p tag, and then to the opening p tag we'll say v-bind hidden, and then let's say equals false initially, and then remove that button, and yeah, let's let's actually remove the second button as well. Maybe I'll just add an HR here so we can separate the different sort of examples. Okay, so in the top here, you can see then that we have this secret text, and it's not hidden because the hidden property is false. If I then say true instead, you can see that the secret text disappears, right? But it's still in the DOM here, but it now has the attribute hidden. And I think this is a good way to segue into the next section, right? Because this next section is using JavaScript expressions. So what they're saying is that when you are binding, you can actually put JavaScript expressions. So they're showing a bunch of examples here where they have 3 examples using the mustache syntax, but then they're also using this vbind. So they're saying vbind or vbind the ID attribute to the list. What is this? The string list dash, and then plus the ID property, right? So it's just, they're showing that you can do string interpolation on the fly within this attribute, or within the sort of where you would otherwise put the name of a variable, right? So it's there's not some magic here. It's just that they're simply evaluating a JavaScript expression when you are binding. But if that JavaScript expression points to a model, a property of your data model, then that value will be inserted instead. So what we can do here, for example, is then, let's say that we add a button which says hide, exclamation point, or something like that, then button, and then let's save that, and let's just look at this, right? So my intention is that, let's start out with false. So my intention is that we start out with showing this secret text, and then when we click hide, we will hide the secret text, and then we will toggle back and forth. So maybe I should say toggle hide. Okay. And so to do that, I think maybe we need something like, let's use if I go back to the main.js file, you see we have this is disabled. So let's change that to say is hidden, and let's start with false. So now in our data model, we have an attribute called is hidden. So if instead of explicitly saying false here, let me say is hidden, and let's save that, and let's refresh. Actually, I'm realizing, sorry, what I wanted to do is that I was thinking maybe you can actually change is hidden on the fly here in the button when we click, but probably you can't do that, because what they're going to say here in just a moment is that you can't do expressions. You can only, you can't do, the other way, you can't do statements, you can only do expressions. So you probably can't mutate. Let me just try that out to see if I'm wrong, right? Let's say vbind, no, what is this, like the click thing, v on click, we want to do is hidden is equal to not is hidden, like that would toggle it, but probably this is not going to work. If I refresh this and I actually it did work. If I press toggle hide, it actually toggles. Let me put the button on top of it so it's not as difficult to click. Here you can see it actually works. So you're actually allowed to do that. So that was pretty cool. I'm wondering then, let's look at the warning that we got here. Oops, so messy. Console, you are running v4 should have explained. Yeah, okay, so no worries, nothing strange. Maybe this is a warning we had before as well. Let me just close this these developers tools. So this actually worked, right? So I'm a bit surprised. I mean, their point. Let's just look at this, right? So what are their examples? Because their examples are essentially that you can sort of manipulate data directly here. So let's just do another example of that. Let's say if I try to render, let's say hidden, I add another p tag and say, and in this I'll just add the text hidden status : and then we want to put is hidden. We want to put the value of the variable is hidden. So I'm assuming, no, okay, so they're actually doing toString on that for me. But let's say we want to do uppercase of that. So how do you do uppercase in JavaScript? It's like to uppercase or something like that, I guess, as a method. Let's call that. Yeah, that didn't work. Uppercase, actually, let's just do this. Jump into node. If I have a string foo, is it to upper? Nope. Uppercase. Nope. uppercase. Oh, actually, we did the correct thing. So we called it correctly. It's 2 uppercase, camel cased, 2 uppercase. Okay, wait. So I'm doing something wrong here. I can't do... okay, maybe we should read the error that we got. Probably we got an error in the console. So, wait, how do I close this? This is too much. Okay, like that. And then let's jump to the console. 2 uppercase is not a function. So maybe I needed to call toString first. But that just kind of feels like it's not making any sense. No, okay, so that I had to do, right? So you can't call to uppercase. Oh, of course, that's pretty stupid of me. Of course, you can't call to uppercase on a Boolean. You have to cast that Boolean to a string, and then you have to call to uppercase, right? So notice how that actually works. Now like the hidden status is false, and we are seeing the secret text. But if I click toggle hide, the hidden status is true, and we're not seeing the hidden text, or we're not seeing the secret text. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a good idea, right? I'm just saying you can do this. So like for trivial things, maybe you could do this. So we're saying then that we're sort of building this interaction directly in the template, directly in the sort of Vue template, rather than in the data model, like in our functions. And probably, I would say, like probably in 99% of the cases, this is the wrong thing to do. Right, which they're also explicitly stating here in the docs, where they're saying somewhere here, la 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 la. I thought they were doing that. Contain one singlet. Actually, they didn't. It was my understanding that they said that somewhere, but maybe I'm wrong, right? Yeah. Okay. Never mind. Okay. So you can do this, but again, like I would assume that it's probably easier for people who read your code. Sorry, now I'm realizing they will say something along those lines when they're talking about filters or something like that, probably. But anyway. No, but I'm so confused. One restrict, because it was explicitly this example, right? Anyways, let's drop that. Yeah, I think somewhere in the documentation they're saying something like if you do this, but that's maybe in regards to filters or something like that. Like when you have this, when you're doing like, okay, message dot split on empty string, then reverse that, and then join that by empty string. I mean, that just means that you're reversing. So probably what you should do is that you should define, for example, a filter called reverse, and then just call that filter instead of sort of inlining this logic into your template. Maybe not, right? Depends on how much you're reusing that over multiple places. Actually, maybe this thing is actually a pretty good example of when I maybe would not introduce a filter because it's sort of kind of trivial, right? But this is sort of a give and take. Depends on the proficiency of the people you're working with, and sort of how much you want to have extremely standardized, right? And then, like if you're really trying to avoid to have code in your templates, like expressions in your templates or not. But like maybe I would, yeah, I mean maybe I would accept having this, and maybe like, I mean, this number plus one for sure. It's like no worries. I mean, it's like why do I need to have to create another variable? Like let's say you're saving the, yeah, I don't know. Never mind. I mean, it's like you're saving one variable in the data model, but then instead of having to introduce like 10 other different variables, if the computations are trivial, then maybe just do the computations in the view directly in the template. But maybe not, right? In many scenarios, it probably makes sense to identify a sensible, like semantically meaningful name for the concept that you're trying to describe. Like give the concept a name, put that name in your data model, and then just render that name instead, right? Like we'll get to computed properties, and we'll get to filters, and we've seen functions already, right? So there are multiple different ways of making something, like constructing something which isn't new data, but is rather some function or some computed property that depends on already existing data that you can run existing data through in order to compute a variant or like a variation of that particular data, such as adding one, or such as reversing a string, or like such as switching on the basis of something, where it's like if you have a Boolean which is true, then you want to render yes, or if it's false you want to render no, which is their second example here. So there are a bunch of different ways of doing that, and of course you could use a function to which you are passing the data that's input to that function, and then that function does that computation. And again, like if you have the same computation in multiple places in the same view or across views, then maybe you should really think about trying to abstract that concept somehow. Okay, let's drop that. You can, however, do this, and I think that was pretty interesting, right? Notice how we have quite a lot of logic here. When we're clicking a button, we are rendering a sort of a variation of a value onto screen, and then we're also hiding versus showing, like toggling, hiding and showing of some text. Without actually sort of interacting with our data model, like without specifying a function in our data model. Now, of course, the interesting portion, I think this would probably be very interesting. If we go into main.js and look at our data model, and if we delete the isHidden property, I think we're probably going to break this, right? If we refresh it, actually we have even errors. Whoops. So what happened here? Yeah. So actually, that's a great view warning. These are some really good errors, right? They're actually telling us exactly what's wrong. So they're saying property or method is hidden, is not defined on the instance, but referenced during render. Make sure that this property is reactive, either in the data option or for class-based components by initializing the property. Blah, 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 blah. So this is what we talked about, where it's like Vue can't be reactive to something that you haven't initially specified in your data object, because then it can't set up these getters and setters, which means that we need to specify this is hidden property in our data model. And we can't just sort of on the fly construct this in the HTML, right? So I guess that would be another great argument, that would be another argument, sensible argument as to why you shouldn't really do this on the fly, right? Because then it's like in your data model, you have this isHidden property that is used nowhere, like seemingly used nowhere within this sort of main component. But it is used in this template actually. Now, okay, I mean, I understand. If you wrote the component like this as an actual component where you have a template, then you would clearly be able to see where it's used. So I guess, I mean, it's like you weigh the pros and cons and look at your particular scenario. But I guess, like as a rule of thumb, I would probably favor putting logic let's say in the model end, right? Like in the Vue instance, as options to the Vue instance, whether that's through computed properties, whether that's through methods, or whether that's through filters. I think they're called filters. Let me just check so that I'm not using the wrong name. Like the things that you can pipe. Watchers, list rendering, form input bindings. Is that really that far in the future? That just seems like it makes no sense. Yeah, filters here. Okay, so it's probably called filters. So whatever, right? But through any of those means, I would probably initially favor. Okay, now to wrap this up. So what they're saying here is that the expressions that will be evaluated seems like they're arbitrary JavaScript, but it's not actually arbitrary JavaScript, right? So firstly, they're saying this: you can't make statements. You can only sort of evaluate an expression. Now, actually, that's not entirely true, as we just noticed, because this, what we put into the click binding here is actually an expression, right? Because we are assigning the inverse of isHidden. We're assigning the not like the whatever value the current whatever the current value of isHidden is currently not. We are assigning the inverse of isHidden to isHidden, so we're flipping it, right? So if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. And since we're saying equals, that's assignment, right? So then that's a statement, clearly. So that's apparently allowed, but I guess then this is sort of an exception, and for some reason they're not mentioning that, maybe because you shouldn't do that. But you notice this var here. I mean, what they're saying is that you can sort of create this new variable foobar and then set that to the inverse of is hidden. If let's actually run that and see what we get, right? Like, I assume error compiling template. Avoid, yeah, okay, so it doesn't even work because they're saying avoid using JavaScript keyword as property name, right? So the compiler is even, or like the Vue parser, I guess, is even confused because it's seeing the keyword var and it's assuming that you're trying to construct a variable called var rather than using the statement var. And I assume that the same thing goes for let and all that stuff. Okay, so that's a no-go, right? And here's another no-go. We can't say if. So if I do this, right? If we try to, I mean, previously we had is hidden. Is equal to not is hidden, right? And that's a way of flipping it. Another way of flipping it would be to say that, like, if is hidden, then is hidden should be equal to, yeah, but it's the same thing. Okay, but if it's hidden, then is hidden should be equal to false. Let me put that closer like this. And else is hidden should be equal to true. I mean, if you were in JavaScript, that statement would be a valid statement, but let's see if that works here. No, so we get a bunch of errors, but actually, if I click toggle hide, it does actually work. That is a bit surprising, to be honest. Why did that actually... That is pretty confusing, right? If I refresh that, we don't have that button, and if I add that button and then we refresh... Yeah, so actually they are able to interact or to execute that piece of JavaScript, but we are getting a Vue error, or actually a Vue warning, right? Because they're again saying avoid using JavaScript keywords such as or avoid using JavaScript keyword as property name, namely if. But still, for some reason, they are actually able to do that. So it seems that they are actually able to render statements or to execute statements and not just expressions. So that's interesting. I didn't know this. Maybe this is more like something that they would really suggest that you don't do. So maybe it's something like, maybe it's not supported, but it might work. I'm just guessing now, right? So that would mean that please don't do it because it might have some unintended consequences because we are not actually intending to support that. But who knows, right? I guess if somebody knows, please do shoot something in the comments. Otherwise, I'll try to find this out, or we will try to find this out as we go forward in the series. But the way that they would suggest that you do this is, of course, by using a ternary expression. Or actually, I mean, it seems like they're not even suggesting you should do assignment at all. So again, like, it seems we are even breaking the rules by doing assignment here. But they showed here the ternary operator, namely this, when they said okay question mark, then render yes, otherwise render no, right? So what we could do is we could do that. So we could say is hidden. Is equal to is hidden question mark, then true, otherwise false. Oh, sorry, actually, if it's true, then it should be false, and if it's false, then it should be true. So let's try that, right? If we refresh that, then that works as well, right? And let me just make sure that this works for the correct reason. So if I'm toggling to the same value, yeah, then we're not toggling, which is expected. So yeah, but again, like, we're probably sort of breaking the intended usage, or we're using it in a non-intended manner now, it seems to me. But yeah, so it does work, but since the documentation is saying that you should not use statements and you should not use flow control, such as, for example, if or while or whatever, then, like, let's not do that, right? Let's agree not to do that because they're saying not to do that. But again, in the future, hopefully we will figure out more about why. And then they're saying this is a really important point, right? They're saying template expressions, which these things are that we are now doing, right? We're adding like an arbitrary JavaScript expression instead of binding to some particular model value. I have to let the cat in, but do feel free to read this warning text until I get back. Wait. Whoop. Why? Okay, so what they are saying is that, this important point is saying that they're whitelisting a bunch of globals. So that means you can, let's do this, right? You can, for example, let's remove the button now, the toggle button. Let's actually go back to main.js file and remove both the is hidden value and the link value that we worked with. And then let's go back to index.html. Let's remove the link. Let's rebind the model. Like we changed the binding of the input text to link, but let's put that back to fruit so that our previous functionality is working as it was before. And then let's remove this secret text, and then let's just have this this p tag here, and let's render something in that p tag. So let's just write hello world for now. Let's refresh this, and let's just make sure that we can still add stuff, right? So that old functionality is still working, and now we've rendered this hello world text. Okay, so what they're saying is that you can, you can put, since you can put an arbitrary JavaScript expression, you should of course be able to say something like math.random, for example. Let's run that, right? You can see if I refresh, we have new random numbers. So math.random works, but that is because the global math has been whitelisted. So they're saying here template expressions are sandboxed. This is probably for important security reasons. Again, like sort of, for example, like the cross-site scripting that we were talking about in the last video. So maybe, I'm just guessing, maybe that's wrong, right? But so they're whitelisting a bunch of globals such as math and such as date. You can't, for example, define your own global. Let's say if I was in main.js and I defined my own global, let's say var, let's say mathy, right? Or let's say mathematics. I'm just gonna misspell that. So okay, let's just say maths. Let's say maths with z, right? And then on maths, we'll put a function that we will call maths. Dot random. Right, is a function that will return math. Actually, let's just do it like this. That will return a math.random number, right? So it's like we're creating our own alias for math, which is called maths. So if I save that and let's refresh this. This is still, we're still just calling math.random in the template, and that works. But let's change for maths. Let's save that and let's run it. Now it just crashes, right? Probably because maths doesn't exist. So what are they saying in the error, right? Property or method maths is not defined on the instance, but referenced during render. Make sure that this property is reactive either. Okay, so this is the same error as before. So they're saying, I'm simply assuming that you've defined this property maths in your data model in your Vue instance. Why are you talking about this thing called maths if it's not defined on your data model, right? Which is also like, initially it might be like, but why couldn't you just allow me to access my globals? But the point is, do it the right way, right? Don't use globals. Let everything should go through the components. Like there's data into components, and then there are function calls that you can make inside of the components. Like they've got you covered, right? You can solve it by just passing data down. It's like if you have a function, instead of that function accessing global variables, just pass whatever dependencies the function need explicitly to that function, right? If a function needs something, then that should be, that the thing that it needs should be an argument to that function. Similarly for a component, if you have a component and if that component needs something, then that thing should be an argument to that component. So in this case, a prop, right? You're passing something down in the component. And this, I don't think have we looked at this or have we not? No, we have looked at this, right? So here we've defined the component cart item. We're probably going to look at this in much more detail, right? But in a previous episode, we looked at this where we have the component cart item, and we're v-binding the property item to the value fruit. Actually, so now I'm realizing we talked before about how you can v-bind to an arbitrary attribute, and we've already actually noticed that because we can v-bind to item here. But of course, the difference being that in the template of the cart item, you can see here that we're actually interacting with item, like we're using this thing called item. So that's being passed down into the component, right? So that's a prop, which we are specifying here as well. We're specifying that this Vue component has a prop called item. Okay, so then it's not actually entirely arbitrary. It's not the same thing as us being able to, as we demonstrated in this episode, bind an arbitrary property such as right to some model. So it's like when we said v-bind : foo equals some value or some variable in our model, right? Then we are binding an arbitrary attribute to some value or some variable in our model. But anyways, okay, what we were saying essentially then is that you can't access this arbitrary global maths that we've defined. But of course, if you pass maths down somehow, like let's do that. Let's jump to main.js and let's actually say maths with using uppercase here is equal to maths, right? We're just passing down this global into our Vue instance through the data, through the model data, right? Through our data object, and now actually it works, right? Now it runs, and it's a function, and we can sort of run that all the time, right? Because we've sort of passed down this dependency downwards to our I mean, I hesitate to say component, but like main component, right? Because it's not really like we've specified it as a component, but it's our main application. It's our main Vue instance. So we're passing down this dependency maths through our model data, or as model data, through our data object that's being passed to the Vue instance. Now, whether you should do this for something like maths, or I mean, of course you should not do this for math.random, because again, like as they were saying, math is the global math is whitelisted, so you don't need to pass math in. You can simply, as we were doing before, just call math.random, and that works fine, because math is whitelisted, so you're allowed to call that. But if you have this arbitrary third-party library, for example, right, then of course that's not whitelisted. So you load that thing in, and then you have that in memory as a global, and then maybe you want to have access to that, so then you have to pass that in. Now, again, you should probably try to find other solutions for that rather than to have the global. No, actually, I mean, if I think about it, yeah, maybe actually that makes sense, right? You would pass that in, but of course, only if you actually need that thing. Just always try to find simpler solutions. But of course, if you need that, if you need that third-party thing, then of course you need that third-party thing, right? And yeah, we'll see. Probably there are, I don't know if we're gonna look at sort of packaging, or like the interacting with the CLI, like they have command line tools, for example, for Vue. So I'm not sure if we're gonna look at that in this series. Let me know in the comments if you think that would be an interesting addition to this series, or whether we should stick only to sort of the basic Vue stuff and not the sort of how to package a Vue application and all of that stuff. But if we do talk about that, then maybe we would talk about how to bundle in third-party libraries, because I'm assuming you would be able to sort of in a file that specifies a component, or that constructs a component, I assume that you would be able to pull in a third-party library through, for example, like Bower or Yarn, or yeah, I mean something like that, right? Or maybe. Depends. I mean, yeah, it depends on how you package it. I mean, it depends on how their ecosystem is working. Since I haven't looked at that, I can't say yet, right? But it might even be that you would include it as a Vue, as a node module, right? Like through require or through import. But we will see. I mean, let me know if you think that discussion would be interesting as well, like looking at the packaging or CLI stuff. Like I'm just assuming that would be in, yeah, here. So right, so there's a tooling section, for example, like TypeScript, production deployment, single file components, all of this stuff, right? So maybe then they also talk a bit about the CLI and all that stuff. Let me know if you think that sounds sensible. Otherwise, I guess we will skip that. But okay, this is this about this. Let me remove this math random statement and this HR, so we have sort of a cleaner application for next time. And we have now talked about using JavaScript expressions here, and that's like the end of that section. And so then we are going to talk about directives next time. Thanks a ton for watching. Hit the like button if you appreciated this video. Remember to subscribe so that you won't miss the next one. And I will see you in the next one.